Come back. Because we want to hear Melvin Morse. That took a little longer than I thought it would, but it was still, I think, very much worth doing. And we're going to take about a break for about 10 minutes. Can we do it in 10 minutes? And grab as much food as you can carry and come back to your seat. But wait a minute, before you go, let me just say one thing. We usually go out to dinner with our speakers after the event over at Ruby's of Siam over on Skokie Boulevard. And it's, each go for your own, or we have, and if we have a small enough table, we divide it among the people there and do group things, except for the speaker. So we will be doing that again today. If anybody wants to come, they're welcome to, as long as they can fit in the restaurant. Have a good session. Listed as one of the best pediatricians in the country. He has very active practice, as well as teaching and creating all kinds of new ideas about things and doing research and writing books. He's enormously busy. He has 5 children, and he's just a very exciting person to be around. Feel very blessed to have him here. A little bit of demonstration right there going on. Let's welcome Dr. Melvin Morse.
I was asked a number of questions before it came up, so I'm going to try to answer them in my talk. I'm not really going to give the same talk that I gave over there. I was just having some fun with y'all. Well, I have talked to groups like this before, and I want to share with you all that I don't usually talk to groups like this. I just don't. I usually talk to doctors and nurses, hospice workers. Much of my work is with grieving parents. Do a lot of grief counseling work, such as that. But I'm always puzzled. A group like this, well, a lot of people said they came to hear me speak, so I understand why you're here. But the rest of you all that have had psychical experiences or near-death experiences, I'm kind of always wondered and really, frankly, puzzled as to why you would come to hear someone like me speak, because you've already had this experience that I'm studying, and you're obviously like way ahead of me. And actually, I know that seems kind of funny the way I put it, but actually sometimes that causes anger. So I'm just going to apologize that, maybe I'm not quite as far ahead as the rest of y'all. And one of y'all was even having a little fun with me, asking how you can activate the right temporal lobe when she obviously has a quite activated right temporal lobe. So just be kind of patient with me. One thing I want you all to understand, I trained at Johns Hopkins for my medical training. I came to near-death research really kind of as a, I just wanted to get a paper. I was at the time training to be a neuro-oncologist, and just saw this as kind of a fascinating aside. At the time there had been no case reports of children having near-death experiences, so it's always nice to be the first person to report something in the medical literature. And that was pretty much my motivation. I think you all will get the best out of my talk if you can cleanse your brain of any philosophical or spiritual preconceptions. And that's why I think my talk goes over better with nurses and doctors and such, because we tend to be more atheistic or agnostic, whereas you all already have firmly rooted spiritual preconceptions. But just to get the bad stuff out of the way, I don't believe there's another side. I don't believe there's any other sides. I hope by the time I've finished talking, you'll understand why I say that. I don't think when people die, they go to another side. I don't think there's another side. There's only one side. There's just, yeah. Our Western philosophy is primarily dominated by what they call materialism, meaning that our bodies are biological machines and this is a clockwork universe. And then there's something called dualism. I just went to this philosophers convention, so I'm really up on all these philosophical terms. And this dualism, to me, is just the same thing as materialism, but this dualism is like there's a ghost in the machine. It's like so I know many people here have had near-death experiences, and the way our society often interprets them is that when you die, there's some sort of gaseous vapor that kind of floats out of your body, and then it kind of condenses on the ceiling, and then it somehow has eyes, it can see around, and then such as that. And since I really came to this field, if you will, with no philosophical or spiritual preconceptions, I don't hold to either of those viewpoints. I see nothing in near-death research to support that we are either machines or we're ghosts in machines. and I want to emphasize the part that I don't see anything to reinforce the concept that we're biological machines, because I know a lot of people, particularly when I don't actually speak to too many groups like this, frankly, because I've had a hard time explaining these concepts, so I'm giving my talk a little bit differently this time, and just say right up front, I also don't believe that we're biological machines. But I think that one philosophy is one and the same. Whether you believe we're machines or you believe there's a ghost in the machine, what's the difference? I think that we need new philosophies to understand at least the scientific information that I'm going to present to you all today. We need new philosophies. So, I'm a pediatrician from Renton. I have a full-time practice of pediatrics. And most of my life is spent with ear infections and such as that. I have no particular calling to this field, if you will. The reason I'm here is because Diane Willis asked me to come. It's just as simple as that. And if you get anything out of my talk today, the thanks should go to Diane Willis. She spent an enormous amount of time, frankly, just trying to get a hold of me. It's true. Diane must put in like about 10 phone calls to my office for one that I've actually returned or discussed. So thank you very much, Diane. Thank you for being so patient. Thank you for facilitating my going to that philosophers convention too. That was kind of cool and really interesting, actually. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. And if I hadn't properly expressed my thanks before, I want to tell you they're quite sincere. I just kind of want to give you kind of the background so you can get the most out of my talk. I think it's going to be, so if you all are more spiritually advanced than me, just be patient with me. Okay, first slide. Oh, do I control them from here? Nope. Is anybody going to run the slide projector? Usually my daughter comes on. My daughter is, I guess, swimming with my mom. Usually my kids come with me on these things and they run the projector for me. That's great.
All the lights, yes.
Yeah, I don't know if we want to have the whole lights off. So you're going to hear what a pediatrician from Renton, who has spent 15 years of studying near-death experiences primarily in children, what I've learned from all of this. That's what I'm going to share with you all today. People wonder, what have I learned from it all? I feel like one of the luckiest people alive, because I've had the privilege of listening to children who have nearly died and returned to tell me what the experience is like. And I don't have to hear them on TV shows, and I don't have to hear them after I've heard the story they've told the story a million times. Don't turn the lights all the way off, because they'll be sleeping in the back. The deal. These are primarily patients that I've resuscitated, or friends of mine have resuscitated. And usually they're children that I've been able to interview for the very first time. That they may, in many cases, haven't even told their parents, etc. So I'm extremely privileged. And I do want to share that information. Somebody before I came up said, do I have a calling or do I have something that's drawn to me to this information? Absolutely not. I'm not a spiritual person. I don't go to church. I was raised in the Jewish faith. My mom is, I'm glad she went swimming and she's not here. Because I can candidly tell you all, I can't even remember when the various Jewish holidays are. One of my partners is Jewish and she's always like, it's Yom Kippur, Mel, you better call your mom. You know, we don't go to church. I don't have any particular religion or faith that I teach to my children. They do sing in a church choir, and that's about the extent of it. I'll have to tell you something cute, though. My kids always come on these trips with me because I don't know. Otherwise, I'm just not. I'm just not one of these people who wants to leave home, leave their family, and all. And so they've heard me lecture and all this sort of thing. So and I talk to myself a lot when I drive in the car. So Cody and Michaela, they were in the back one day, and they see me kind of mumbling and talking to myself, really about some problem I was having at the office or whatever. And Cody says, "What's he doing, Michaela?" And Michaela goes, "Oh, he's talking to angels." That's all he heard. So they obviously have the wrong idea too. Okay. So what do I learn from all this stuff? I'm going to share with you all today what I've learned, and I'm going to try to answer a whole bunch of really good questions that I was asked before this. I've written them all down. Except for that one question about how to activate the right temporal lobe. That was a trick question, I know that. From a shiatsu massage therapist. I hope by the end of this talk, though, you'll understand why I would make such a comment. Okay. University professor reveals new proof of life after death. From people who have been to a world beyond the grave and returned. This is one of the more prestigious medical journals that I've been published in. When I saw this in the supermarket, I promptly ran out and bought 5 copies for my mom. Actually, I didn't even know it was me until I started reading the article. So that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm not. I know that that's our common sense view of these experiences. They're somehow proof of life after death. And they may be. They may be proof of life after death. I'm not saying there isn't life after death. And I'm not saying that they're not proof of life after death. I'm simply saying that is not my interest, nor is it what I have learned from studying these experiences. In fact, I've never interviewed a child who has died and returned to life. And I've certainly don't see the importance of these experiences as teaching us about life after death. Next slide. It is worthwhile dying to find out what life is. So these experiences tell us something extremely important about life itself and how we can live our lives to the fullest and how we can understand our relationship between man and what, for lack of a better word, most people call God and the universe at large. And that's what I've learned from these experiences. I've learned to trust my own intuition. I've learned to understand how psychical experiences intrude into my own life and how I can best make use of those understandings. I've learned the varieties of spiritual and psychical experiences and how I can understand myself, whether I've had one or not. And this is one of the most troubling things that I see just in people struggling to understand these experiences. So many times people say to me, well, I know I didn't have a near-death experience. And then they'll go on to tell you some incredibly beautiful experience. some experience that, could start a religion. It's so beautiful. And then they'll go, and they'll say, well, why wasn't that a near-death experience? Oh, well, because there was no tunnel in it. Or because, it wasn't an official approved experience, stamped by the International Association of Near-Death Studies, or wasn't like my neighbor's near-death experience, or wasn't what I thought an experience would be like. And that's what I've learned, is how to understand when these experiences happen to us, how to interpret them, and how to use them to bring meaning into our lives. And in my area of expertise, which is pediatrics, I primarily use this to help people to understand the processes of dying and how they can best handle the grief associated with dying. And one of the most important aspects for those of you who work with the dying, for those of you who have had a death of someone that you love, is, as you know, is to reinfuse meaning into your life. And there's nothing more painful, of course, than the death of a child, and there's nothing more meaningless than the death of a child. That defies nature, that a child would die before a parent. And yet we can find things in our own lives which can help us to reinfuse meaning, and that can prevent complex guilt and grief. So that's my primary interest in these experiences, is to understand how they can, just in common sense words, how can I have such an experience? And how I can bring the meaning of these experiences into my life. A child told me once the best. I asked her what was the meaning of these experiences. And she said that she saw a light when she nearly died, and now she sees pieces of that light everywhere in her life. And that's what I've tried to do, and that's what I've tried to learn. Another, we were talking at the Philosophers Convention. Well, why don't people just, try to have this experience again and again? Why don't they just try to kill themselves so they can have this wonderful experience if it's so cool? And again, I'm so privileged that, children are my guides. And a child told me once that she learned from her experience that life is for living and the light is for later. They always say these things like little Zen proverbs. They're so cool. All right. So it's worthwhile dying to find out what life is, and I'm not going to talk about life after death. You guys got that. Next slide. Okay, what am I talking about? Why am I interested in these experiences? This is a child that nearly died of fulminant bacterial meningitis at my hospital, Valley General Hospital, was subsequently airlifted to Seattle Children's Hospital. This is my associate here, David Christopher. He has his arms partially flexed. He's got his finger interdigitated properly on his chest, on the young girl's chest. He gets an A for cardiac resuscitation, also that she successfully survived. And all the little details of this drawing are accurate, even though she was quite comatose when this experience occurred. The figure at the head of the bed there is wearing a hat. That's important, as the tradition in our hospital is that the resuscitating physician who is running the team wears a hat. And so they can be easily picked out in the hubbub of resuscitation.
Wow.
We see her then floating above. For those of you who are art therapists, you might be interested in seeing she has no feet. This rainbow invariably occurs in the top left corner of these pictures. And she said that this rainbow was a light that told her who she was and where she was to go. And then I love the way kids are. I said, what do you mean by that? I don't know. And this seated figure here is Jesus with a red hat. And for Christians in the audience, you'll be delighted to know that she stated that he is very nice. And then don't forget this part here. To Dr. Morse, I like you very, very much. And it's interesting, this is a Protestant girl, and for those of you who who are philosophically or religiously inclined, it is interesting that in that bottom right-hand corner, she said that was a door where people who were going to be born came in and out of. So I thought that was a kind of intriguing, since she didn't have a family belief in reincarnation. So these are the kinds of experiences that interested me and excited me. I was working as a critical care physician in Pocatello, Idaho. Picked up a young girl who had fixed and dilated pupils, which to us is a sign of impending brain death. And she had been documented as having no heartbeat or spontaneous respiration for 19 minutes. And yet she was successfully resuscitated. And she told me her entire resuscitation blow for blow. She said, I saw the tall, thin doctor say, thank God you're here. She said, I saw you on the phone calling someone saying, what should I do next? I saw you put a tube down my nose. I saw you put me in a donut-like machine, which was her description of a CAT scanner. All of these little details she got accurate. And she also told me of a spiritual journey, which at the time was not terribly interesting to me. Her spiritual journey was that she went through a tunnel with a woman named Elizabeth to a place she thought was heaven. As a young neuro-oncologist, I was mostly interested in how she could have any memories of her experience at all. How could she, the gods that I worship, Plum and Posner wrote a book called The Diagnosis of Stupor and Coma, and they tell us that coma wipes clean the slate of consciousness. So how could this profoundly comatose patient, who I knew did not have a waxing and waning level of consciousness, that you might, maybe she heard little things or something like that as she's coming out of it. That was not the case with her. How could she remember this experience at all? But of course, at the time, we thought these experiences were not real. Absolutely not. And I think that everybody in our society today has that problem. I think that's why there is such an organization like this. I think that's why there's such a tremendous interest in these experiences. I think that for most of human history, we wouldn't have groups like this. Everybody knows that they'd be real. I think, if you look at the history of medicine, if you look at the history of death and dying, it's only been a recent development in the last 500 to 600 years at best, that we have forgotten what it's like to die, that we've taken the dying and shunted them off out of the mainstream of our lives, and that we no longer acknowledge or believe in spiritual realities. So what I'm saying is that I doubt there was any sort of international association in near-death studies 1,000 years ago, because such a thing would have been unnecessary. But today, I know even of those of you who have had profoundly spiritual experiences, on one level wonder, are they real? And on another level, at least if you know they're real, because they have that quality of reality, do not find that the experience resonates with our society as a whole. And our Seattle chapter of IANS frequently calls these woo-woo experiences. And I hope that after my talk today, none of you will ever think of these as woo-woo experiences, but will see them as a natural and normal part of the human condition. And of course, children, I think, often illustrate this the best. The young girl that drew this drawing told no one of her experience for well over a year, until I interviewed her as part of my study. And I asked her why not. And she said, I didn't think you were supposed to be able to talk to God.
Oh boy.
And that says it all. Talk to God as we are talking right now. And that tells you how vividly real these experiences are. And that's an important point. Remember, I shared with you that one of the things that I've learned is how to distinguish between true spiritual experiences and dreams and hallucinations and, feeling fuzzy from not eating enough that day, etc. and the quality of reality. One child said it best. He said it was realer than real, is one hallmark of these experiences. But are they real? I'm going to share with you another story. Saw a young man whose family, the parents were ski instructors. And they were coming back from teaching skiing to the Seahawks. They were celebrity ski instructors in Seattle. And it was a very snowy day. Their car came off of I-90 and plunged over an embankment, flipped over several times, and went into a river that had extremely cold water. The father was killed on impact. The mother was able to free herself by ultimately kicking her feet against the windshield and smashing out the windshield and swimming to the surface. And the young man was seatbelted in the back and sank to the bottom of this river. So heroic was his rescue that the man who rescued him was given the Washington State Troopers Award to civilians for heroism for that year. They formed a human chain, and one person went, on the bottom of this human chain into the car and took him out. And his experience was, it's so great to hear these experiences for the first time, I want to tell you that. His experience was, he said the car filled up with water and then everything went all blank. And then he said he was in the huge noodle. And he says, well, wait a minute. It couldn't have been a noodle. It must have been a tunnel, because I don't think noodles have rainbows in them. And he then described going through this huge noodle. First he went to an animal heaven, then he ultimately went to a human heaven, had a variety of different encounters, met his dead grandmother, etc. Now, I'm going to come to the issue of cultural embellishment or conditioning in these experiences, which they are highly influenced by our culture. But lest anybody be offended by the rest of my lecture, I want to point out that there's aspects to these that are so odd and idiosyncratic that they defy cultural training. And this young man was a great example of that. After his resuscitation, he was just preoccupied with a piece of music that he heard in heaven. He wanted to play some wonderful heavenly music. And he insisted that his mom buy him a keyboard, and he taught himself to play this piece of music. And so I'm sure everybody here has an idea of what this beautiful heavenly music must have sounded like, because we all know what heavenly music is like. Well, at least I had an idea. It would be, some sort of wondrous, beautiful, like the kind of music they play at, meetings like this, that, New Age kind of music. No way! It was like this really weird atonal jazz music. It was like, bling, 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 but it was clearly music. I mean, it was neat. But it was not like any kind of heavenly music I had ever heard before. And yet he definitely said this was music that he had heard in heaven. Now, he asked me the same question that I've asked myself. He said, but was my experience real? Children are often the best skeptics. Or was it just a hallucination? Was it just a dream? Is the way he put it, actually. So was it real? And then he puts his finger on the heart of the issue. Because if it's real, we have to tell all the old people. Very true. I think that's what I'm going to get to. Yeah. So we got to tell all the old people that it's really real. Now, his mom then, after hearing his story for the first time, said to me, well, if his experience is real, Dr. Morse, maybe my experience was real too. And what was her experience? Her experience was this. She stated that after she swam to the surface of the river and got herself crawling, etc., to the bank of the river, She sort of lay there exhausted by the side of the river and watched this human chain of volunteers rescuing her son. And she stated that her husband was sitting there next to her on a rock. And he was looking just like he always does, and he was smiling very peacefully and saying to her, "Everything's fine. Don't be so worried. Everything is going to be all right." And she turned to him and she screamed, "What do you mean? Why aren't you out there helping our son? Nothing is all right. How can you even say that?" And he disappeared. He vanished as she yelled at him those words. And she didn't think, yeah, right. Similar relationship with my wife, yeah. And she forgot about this experience, but had many more such experiences. Sometimes he would come and embrace her and hold her. Sometimes he would talk to her. So she had what we call after-death communication. One of the most commonly described experiences in the medical literature. Well over 50% of spouses have such communications or intuitions or feelings with the death of their spouse. Well described for well over, 200 years. But she just thought it was a crazy widow's dream, as she put it herself. And she had no faith or no belief or any context to make this seem real. And yet hearing her son's near-death experience, somehow, in some way, she made an intuitive association and said, yes, then my experience must have been real too. And that got me thinking about this whole issue. Because right now, in the medical literature, and from the scientific viewpoint, we know there's a variety of death-related visions, but we have no unifying way to understand them. We have no context to put them in. I'll explain what I mean by that. Well described and documented that people have premonitions of death, shared dying experiences, then the near-death experience, which in not my opinion, I think it's now an established scientific fact that these are the dying experience, and then after-death communications. And people, I think, intuitively associate them all, but from the scientific viewpoint and from the medical and scientific literature, that's not the case at all. Premonitions are considered to just be retrospective falsifications. The thinking being that everybody has, dreams that their dad's going to die, and when your dad really does die, then you assign meaning to that dream, and everybody else that had a dream that their dad was going to die, they just forget about that dream. So that's the standard way of seeing a premonition of death. Shared dying experience, very well documented in medical literature. I'll describe those in a moment. Those would just be that you feel very close to a patient. You have a wonderful sense of closeness with that patient. When the patient dies, you have a preconception or a longing to heal your own grief, and so you fantasize and invent shared dying experience. The near-death experience, of course, dismissed as a hallucination. And then after-death communications, kind of a complex way they have what they call memory engram, the memory engram theory. That, like for example, I was telling you how this widow had the perception that her husband was hugging her. Well, he had hugged her thousands and thousands of times during their life together. So that formed what they call a memory engram. And so that somehow that memory engram could somehow have a life of its own and be activated, and she could remember it, but remember it as a palpable feeling. I'm reviewing all of this because it's so twisted and convoluted that the speculations that I'm going to share with you later in this talk, I hope seem child's play compared to them. Certainly, the one thing I do want to tell you, I'm going to present with you all a new scientific paradigm. and a new way of understanding these experiences and life in general. And if my paradigm seems extraordinary or speculative or on shaky scientific ground, I want you to think about the alternative, the memory engram theory of after-death communication. I don't know. That's even a further stretch that I'm going to share with you by the end of this talk. And one thing I'm going to share with you is that people who are so-called skeptics in this field are the least scientific people I know.
That's right.
Absolutely. And I'm going to share with, let's just roll through. Premonitions of death. Okay, you heard the theory. Lots of people have these dreams, somebody's going to die, and someone does die, and we assign meaning to just that dream. Okay. Not true. We did a beautiful study of sudden infant death. We showed that 33% of parents who have infants die of sudden infant death have very specific and easy to quantify premonitions that their baby is going to die. And we took the trouble to have 2 control groups, not just one. Because we knew, different researchers might influence their subjects in different ways. I did a control group of my patients in Seattle, in which I simply asked my patients to write down all the dreams and feelings that they had about their baby for the first year of life. And the group that I worked with, the Southwest Sudden Infant Death Research Group, which is the nation's largest research group on sudden infant death, they did the same thing with several of their physicians. So we actually took the time to look at this issue. Is it true that everybody is having these premonitions? And it is absolutely not true. I'll give you an example. The typical kind of premonition or feeling that parents had associated with the death of that our control population had was this. They'd be sitting there watching TV, they suddenly have a feeling, oh my God, my baby's died. They jump up and run to the baby's room and the baby's fine. That's the most common type of control premonition, if you will, that we found. In contrast, here's an example of a premonition. A woman has a dream in which this is actually one of my own patients. In her dream, she floated out of her body, and the dream was real. It was unlike any dream she had ever had before. It's what they call a lucid dream. It had the quality of reality to it. And it wasn't a dream state like she was going somewhere else. She saw who she was. She saw where she was. She looked down at her sleeping body below her. And a woman in white was next to her. And the woman, very lovingly and very tenderly, said to her, she will not be allowed to keep that baby. And then the next day, that baby died of sudden infant death. We did not hear that kind of dream in our control populations. There is only one other study of premonitions that I'm aware of, and they found similar results, a group out of Switzerland. And to give you an idea, tragically or bizarrely, how fixed our worldview is in this sort of reductionistic, materialistic worldview, even though those authors found the same thing we did, they bizarrely concluded that somehow these parents must have wished their baby to have died, or because they had no alternative, because it seems absurd. How can we have premonitions of the future? And I hope that I'll share with you all today how that is in fact possible. Okay, what's a shared dying experience? I'm going to tell you a beautiful shared dying experience that I hope will resonate with you all in terms of understanding a lot of the complexities of these experiences in general. This is a shared dying experience. This is actually a mother of one of my patients. She and her sister were sitting with their mother, so the grandmother of my patient, who was dying of ovarian cancer. And they're watching the movie The Joy Luck Club, which which is all about mothers and daughters. So it's kind of a beautiful thing. And they knew their mother was dying, but they didn't know it was today or even next week or next month. They just happened to go over there and watch a movie with her. And during the movie, they both fell asleep. The two girls did. And when they woke up, the mother had died. And each of them had a dream. And here was their dream. One girl, or well, I think of them as the mother, but it's too confusing because it's really the grandmother. So one of the girls had a dream that she was walking down a golden pathway with her mom, and they were walking hand in hand. And they came to some gates, and not pearly gates, but more like the gates that you would see in a cemetery, kind of like a sort of rusty iron gates. And the mother then turned and looked at her and said, "Everything is okay. Please don't be sad. But only I can go further." And then she woke up. Listen to the other sister's dream. The other sister dreamed she was running with her mother on golden sands on a beach. And then she just had the perception that only her mother could go on. So, I'm going to come back to this issue again and again and again. The actual content of these experiences you can't take too seriously. Well, if you're the person having the experience, take it very seriously, because it comes from your own psychology, and it's clearly designed in a way to give you your own sense of meaning, and how it'll help you to interpret the experience in the best possible way for you. But nevertheless, these two women clearly had a shared dying experience about their mother's death, and yet the details of the experience, at least from my standpoint, are irrelevant. Okay, then the near-death experience I'm going to talk about in a moment, and then after-death communications. The after-death communications, 75% of parents who have a child die will have an after-death communication. 50%, as I shared with you before, of spouses will have such communication. I routinely warn parents of this because oftentimes they think they're going crazy when their child reappears to them or they hear their child crying in the middle of the night. I'm going to tell you about such an experience. I've already shared with you that I'm a pediatrician. I have an extremely busy practice. My life is primarily seeing ear infections in children and such as that. I have a tremendous interest in autism, attention deficit disorder. It's been about 2 years now. I walked into the exam room and there was a couple there and no child. And I was, well, how can I help you today? And the mother says to me, "It's been 2,083 days since my son died." And I'm like, oh, great, my waiting room's packed. I'm already an hour behind. My nurse is, giving me a hard time. This is going to be a quick one. And not only that, but I have never had a child die. I have 5 children. I've never had a child die. I'm not competent to counsel such parents. And then they even went further. They said, and we've been to Raymond Moody's workshop, and we've been to Brian Weiss's workshop, and we've been to every workshop around the country, and we've seen all the, so-called experts. They're experts. I'm a so-called expert. And we have not gotten relief. In fact, I haven't slept in the whole 2,083 days. And I'm like, well, you've been to a weekend workshop with Raymond Moody, and in our 15-minute appointment, I don't think, I don't know. So, I didn't even know what to do. So, but, as I'm sure Diane would say, there's no coincidences, or if my mom was here, she'd say that. At that very moment, I was called to the nursery, and for an emergency delivery. And so I was like, great. Saved by the bell. So I jump up and I say, I'm very sorry, I've got to go over to the hospital. And the mom says, but, I want you to at least see our son. And she presses into my hand a photograph of her son. And he was a young man, actually. I've gotten used to this in pediatrics now. He must have been 18 or 19, but they still call him their son. I mean, when I think of my practice, I usually think of much smaller children. And, well, my mom's 83, and, you know, she still thinks of me as about 5 or 6, so. Well, I know you never lose that. My girls are grown up too, you know. So, I ran over to the hospital, and it turned out it was a false alarm. It's no big deal, the baby was fine. So I was writing up my notes, and one of the nurses over there, who has had a variety of different psychical experiences, in fact, I like to kid her because I say that she cost our hospital $1 million, because at least she was present. She denies she had anything to do with this, but she was present when our entire electrical system shorted out and did cost our hospital $1 million. And she just happened to be by the generator that day. And she had a variety of these experiences. And so she says to me, well, who's the medical student who was with you today? And I have a variety of different students and residents that work with me. I said, well, I don't actually have a student today. And she said, oh, no, I've been watching that student that went in the room with you and, went in the Dell room with you and such as that. And I said, no, you must be mistaken. That's not my student. I don't have a student today. And then she sees the picture that I had just kind of, and she said, no, that's the student right there. And then that gave me a thought. And I said, oh, wow, that's really interesting. And I walked back to the office and I said to that mother, so your child has never tried to contact you? You've come all this way. They lived in New York. You've come all this way to talk to me about your son, and your son has never contacted you? And they said, oh, yes. Whenever I wake up in the morning, or even while I'm sleeping, he's there at the foot of my bed. And he's saying, don't worry, mother, stop crying. I'm okay. But that's just a dream. So that's a nice example, and that's actually a typical after-death communication. Invariably, after-death communications are quite simple. They're almost like these signposts that you see on the side of the road, that say, in commemoration of someone who died here. They usually have this very brief, simple message. Please stop crying, I'm okay. I do know of more complex after-death communications, and they're wonderfully prosaic. By that I mean I have one child who tells me, this is a great story, he was fishing with his dad when his uncle died. And so he had the perception that his uncle came to him while they were fishing. They were fishing up at, I think it's Deep Lake, one of the lakes near me in Lake Washington. And so he saw his uncle just walking by. So he says to his dad, oh, I saw, Uncle so-and-so. And the dad says, no, that can't be, because, he's at home, he couldn't possibly have seen him. And so they returned home, and of course, the uncle had died. But what's so fascinating about this is that the uncle returns from time to time, and they talk about things like carpentry projects, things that he's doing in school, nothing that you would expect, some glorious after-death communication. It's always very prosaic kinds of things. He's having some trouble figuring out how to do a school project, and his uncle comes and helps him with that. So that's an after-death communication. And I wanted to develop, I wanted to make sense of all these different types of experiences. And I could not accept that we put them each into a different little pigeonhole, and that there's, as I studied, what so-called skeptics think of these experiences, it became obvious to me that they either swept the experiences under the rug, said that they didn't really exist, or had some bizarrely convoluted explanation for them. And if the test of any scientific theory is that it better explains the existing facts, and better explains more of the known facts, and then is simpler than prior explanations, that's worthy then of being a scientific hypothesis or theory. And I'm going to share with you today 3 scientific facts. Now, remember I've said 3 scientific facts. So that, I'm not saying they're true facts. Scientific facts change. It was once a scientific fact that the earth was flat. So I'm not in any way saying that these are true facts. I'm just saying that given the state of the art today, these are generally accepted by anyone who objectively looks at the scientific and medical literature, these three facts. Okay. You know, I often hear people say that science is against religion and, you know, such as that. And as I've already alluded to, sure, the science of the 19th century is butting heads with the philosophies of the 18th and 17th century, you bet. The outdated philosophies and scientific theories. But modern science, in the year 2002, has frankly outstripped our philosophies, is way ahead. In fact, people in this room here, rather than seeing yourselves as isolated from society, should see yourselves as forerunners who can perhaps best interpret this kind of information for society at large. Because right thank you very much. That's the end of my talk. Thank you. Well, emergency. Well, I just think it's an irony, you know, that oftentimes people that have these experiences say they're weird or strange or such as that. And yet, as I'm going to get to, I feel that they're quite normal and natural indeed. Next slide.
Hit the top button, nearest one.
You gave up. See, my daughter, she would be like right in the trenches there. Okay, what are near-death experiences? You know, a lot of these slides I'm just going to skip because, as I told you, I do this for doctors and such, and didn't really feel like rearranging my slides for this talk. But nevertheless, I just want to point one thing out about near-death experiences, because I see that as the bedrock. Just like that remember the noodle story, and then the mom had the after-death communication? You know, she basically said to me, if near-death experiences are real, then the rest of these experiences may be real too. And near-death experiences are uniquely susceptible to being studied both clinically and experimentally, whereas after-death communications and premonitions of death are more difficult because, of course, they occur spontaneously. We can't actually look at them in the laboratory setting. Now, in a group, like, you know, that's why we went to a group of parents that had infants die of sudden infant death, because, you know, that's a population we expected to have premonitions, etc. But nevertheless, that's a fairly difficult study to do. But any explanation that I can give you of near-death experiences has to explain how patients who are in profound coma can have the experience, such as survivors of cardiac arrest, but also people whose brains are not dysfunctional at all. Mountain climbers who fall from great heights. They don't have a lack of oxygen to their brain, they don't have any drugs on board, and yet they describe the identical experience. I think in the handout that I saw here is the Journal of the Swiss Alpine Club at the turn of the last century. Very nice description of spiritual experiences that are identical to modern near-death experiences. And mountain climbers who fall from great heights and yet survive. Heard the impact of their body hitting the ground, actually saw themselves fall, accompanied by angels, etc. Next slide. Okay, we all know what a near-death experience is. This is the modern, late 20th century Euro-American near-death experience. I'm just going to tell you, I've known Raymond Moody for many, many years. Raymond Moody inspired me in this research it must be now 20 years ago. Raymond Moody heard of my work in children, came to visit me. My wife and I couldn't believe it was the distinguished Raymond Moody because of the way he was dressed and such as that. And he happened to be inadvertently staying at a hotel off the airport strip in Seattle that is known for prostitution and such as that. I didn't even know they let people stay the whole night there. I thought it was right. And we picked up Raymond and took him home with us. And he and I talked for about 3 straight days. Never stopped. Even went into resuscitated patient, interestingly enough. And he followed right along with me, and we yacked right through the resuscitation. But I always have a little fun with Raymond because I tell him that the silver cord got swallowed up in his tunnel. because that's why I say this is the modern Euro-American near-death experience, frequently describing a tunnel. At the turn of the last century, you rarely heard about tunnels and primarily heard about silver cords. That was the metaphor at that time. The body was, hovering out of the body and connected by a silver cord. So the silver cord is lost in Raymond Moody's tunnel. Next slide. Okay, we've all heard that these are hallucinations. That's what everyone says, just hallucinations of the dying brain. They're not hallucinations. There's a huge medical literature on what hallucinations are. Dozens and dozens of studies of what happens to you when you have a lack of oxygen to your brain with beautiful descriptions. And to make a long story short, near-death experiences, first of all, they're memories of a past event, unlike a hallucination. Second of all, the patients are what we call oriented to time, place, and person, meaning they know who they are, they know where they are, they accurately describe the events going on around them, and yet superimposed or intruding on this reality is the perception of another reality. So typically we think of hallucinations as causing distortions of body image or denials of reality. Intensive care unit psychosis frequently involves the patients getting a serious operation for heart disease, and yet they stubbornly insist they're at home having tea with their wife. Here's a common hallucination in kids, intensive care unit hallucination. One young man told me that monsters dressed in white were chasing him and sticking him full of needles. It's a distortion of reality. That is in fact happening to him, but it's not exactly the way he perceives it. So they're not at all like, another example of the many of the so-called skeptics not reading the medical literature, not doing their homework. They're not like hallucinations at all. Next slide. They're in fact a state of mystical consciousness. They have more in common with the spiritual experiences of saints throughout history, etc. Those of you who often say, well, I didn't really have a near-death experience, and then you tell like the most beautiful experience you can imagine, but it didn't happen in the context of nearly dying, those experiences have much more in common with near-death experiences than hallucinations do. Next slide. And it is not at all unscientific to study this kind of thing. Frequently I'm criticized for doing so. I do want to remind at least the physicians and skeptical types in the audience that the most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious, the source of all art and science, and that's by Albert Einstein. Next slide. Okay. The standard medical explanation for these experiences is that they're confabulations. And by confabulation we mean that the mind hates a memory gap, and so after the patient's resuscitated, and maybe they were waxing and waning in consciousness, they heard little pieces of what was going on around them, maybe they even came out for a while, out of coma for a while unbeknownst to the physicians, and then they blend this all together with their religious expectations, etc., and they put it into a coherent story. And the reason that that's enticing to physicians and medical scientists is because we confabulate all the time. Absolutely. Most of the memories that you all think you have aren't real memories. They've done beautiful studies in which they have people, tell them what their birthday party was like at age 10, and then document what it really was like, and they find it's nothing like that at all. So we're constantly blending information that we think we should have, stealing pieces of other people's lives, putting in our perceptions of what we think life should be like, and blending them into pleasing memories. And then we also know that lots of patients that have memory gaps rarely will acknowledge memory gaps, but frequently will just fill in details that they seamlessly make up on an unconscious level. Nobody's saying these people are making this stuff up, but it's just on an unconscious level. So, and that's coupled with there's no paradigm to understand anything else. We have no way of understanding how a comatose brain that isn't functioning could possibly have any experience at all, be it a spiritual experience or whatever it is. Science always has a hard time if it doesn't have a paradigm to follow. So that's why, if you're wondering why for so long these things were dismissed, it's because of our prevailing philosophy, not because of the science. Next slide. Okay, our study was very different. We didn't undertake to see if these experiences were real. We made no effort to document the objective reality of these patients' perceptions. Instead, we just had one simple question. Are these experiences the dying experience, or are these experiences falsifications of the brain after the fact? That's all we wanted to know. Are they the dying experience? If so, then Chris, that's the boy that went through the noodle, his point was well taken. We should start telling all the dying people that this is what they can expect. Oh, I didn't tell you about the $4 billion a year. Usually I throw that in. I'm going to throw it in now. Lest you all think that this is just a bunch of touchy-feely woo-woo stuff. By the way, at the end of this talk, I hope I'll have convinced you that by listening up to these experiences and belonging to organizations like this and institutionalizing the understandings we can gain from studying these experiences would save our country $4 billion a year. So this is a dollar and cents issue. It's not just a bunch of woo-woo, touchy-feely philosophy. And I hope I'll convince you of that. Boy, I got a lot on my plate to have convinced you by the end. Alrighty, so did they really happen at death, or did they happen after the fact? Next slide. Okay, I'll just run through these pretty quickly. We did a study at Seattle Children's Hospital on this issue over about a 20-year period. Next slide. Just to reassure you, we had the most mainstream medical people involved. I have no trouble publishing this kind of stuff in the medical literature. Everything I'm going to tell you today I've published in mainstream medical journals. American Medical Association Pediatric Journal, Current Problems in Pediatrics. Boy, I have no difficulty. I could publish as many studies and as many papers on this as I could write. It is not true that this sort of thing is frowned upon by science. The science here is straightforward and well accepted. I recently published something in one of the England's major journals for mainstream scientists and theoretical physicists. I'm invited to Tokyo at one of these international consciousness seminars. The University of Arizona has published a number of my papers and abstracts. This kind of stuff is fairly solid, and that's because I've always worked with the most mainstream and normal people I can find. Don Tyler is the head of the intensive care unit at Seattle Children's Hospital, with the exception of me, right? And Jared Milstein is head of the Department of Neurology at Seattle Children's Hospital. Kim Clark, many people here now, social worker at the time at Harborview Hospital. Nancy Evans Bush, the International Association of Near-Death Studies. Next slide. And I work with Bruce Grayson, then at the University of Connecticut, now at the University of Virginia. Vernon Neppy, Director of Neuropsychiatry at the University of Washington, and Bill Serdale at the University of Montana. Next slide. And this is funded by the National Cancer Institute. I'm very grateful for their support. And I'm one of the few studies at that time, although funding is getting easier in this area. Next slide. Okay, our questions were quite simple. What do children remember after having a cardiac arrest? Just that simple. Not did they have a near-death experience, not did they see God. How do these memories compare to what our society calls near-death experiences? And what experiences do a seriously ill but not critically ill control group remember? So if the confabulation theory is correct, if this is caused by a lack of oxygen to the brain, to drugs, etc., then we would expect that our control patients would also describe the experience. Next slide. And these are really sick patients. Unlike what you see on TV, having your heart stop is really bad for you. Most people die if their heart stops. And very difficult to resuscitate patients, even in the operating room. And most of them are left with profound neurological deficits. To give you an example how difficult it is, we typically had to review 300 charts to find one person that fit our criteria, which was a healthy child who nearly died and returned to full health. Next slide. And these are our control patients. So we deliberately stacked the deck with our control patients. We've heard that these things are caused by drugs. We looked at lots of drug overdoses. We've heard that these things are caused by lack of oxygen to the brain. We found lots of patients that presented with profound hypoxia, meaning a very low oxygen level in their bloodstream. We've heard that these experiences are caused by anesthetic agents. Sure. So we looked at that and looked at patients who had elective surgery and such as that to see if we could find these experiences. Next slide. And we tried to match both groups. And most importantly, all of our patients, be them control or critically ill, were hospitalized in the scary intensive care unit, had disease processes that they and their parents thought they were going to die from, and were intubated and mechanically ventilated. And patients, you take the average 4-year-old and you intubate them, mechanically ventilate them, put them in the scary intensive care unit, and you bet they think they're going to die. The difference being that we, from a medical perspective, did not see them as having a life-threatening condition. And these patients were identified prospectively, meaning that we didn't hear their experiences and then decide which group to put them in. We went the other way around, the right way to do it. Next slide. And these are the kinds of questions we asked. So I'm a pediatrician. I often say to patients things like, you have a monkey in your ear? Guess what? They say yes. New proof of tiny simians in children's ears undiscovered by medical science? No, people like to please the powerful adults in their lives. Adult researchers have the same problem. You ask a person, did you see God? They're going to feel spiritually inadequate if they didn't, see God. So maybe they'll have the urge to say they saw something they didn't say. We worked around that by asking these kinds of simple questions. What do you remember about being unconscious? Or, according, of course, to words according to the age of the child. Next slide. And our results were spectacular. Virtually every child that survived cardiac arrest had such an experience. And I want to emphasize that this study has been replicated by the University of Utrecht, recently published in The Lancet last year, and has been replicated at Boston Children's Hospital. And even more importantly and more excitingly, we now have experimental evidence that near-death experiences are real. And by real, I mean that they really happen to people when they die, and that they're no different than any other human experience. I'm not saying that they're objectively real, that the heaven they see is an objectively real heaven. I'm only saying that they cannot be dismissed as hallucinations. And that experimental evidence came out of the National Warfare Institute. And I'll bet you that's the amazing part about this field. I think a generalist like myself has an advantage because I don't have any kind of subspecialty, so it's easier for me to see the whole range of information. Whereas if you really specialize in a field, you're often unaware of what's going on in other fields. And a guy named Jim Winery, who's a good friend of mine, since he did his research, worked at the National Warfare Institute trying to understand what happens to fighter pilots when they accelerate at high speeds. And he published this in one of the aeronautics and science journals. So one of the most important advances in consciousness research that I'm aware of was buried in an aeronautics and science journal. And what he did was he took fighter pilots and whirled them at tremendous speeds, faster and faster and faster, until they reached G-forces of 16 and to a point where theoretically they would die. And he's able to vary his centrifuge runs. He can go 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 25 minutes, 30 minutes, and he can vary the amount of force that the pilots suffered. And he found exactly what we found. And that is, my research showed that if you're just really sick, and if you're just unconscious and have a lack of oxygen to your brain and all the dysfunction associated with being really sick, that's not enough. It's only when you get sicker to the point of death. These cardiac arrest patients that had over a 50% chance or 40% chance of of dying, only then does consciousness return. So the individual elements of the experience are not all that interesting to me, but that consciousness returns it all at the point of death is fascinating. He found exactly the same thing. As he increased his centrifuge runs, he has the advantage because he can stop the runs, like I said, after 15 minutes and ask the pilots what they experienced. And so after the pilots lost muscle tone, and after they became unconscious, and after they had seizures, I say, the hallmark of science is that we can replicate experimental studies. This probably will not be replicated on civilian populations anytime soon. After that, only after that, when he whirled them so fast that theoretically the blood would stop flowing in their brains, and interestingly enough, stop flowing at the level of the temporal lobes. Only then did these pilots report a return to consciousness. And they reported similar experiences that many of you all have had today. Interestingly enough, they report experiences much similar to the children's experiences. And I don't know whether that has something to do with fighter pilots or whatever. Well, because they don't embellish. They're not really, and I mean embellish in the sense of they don't have a lot of personal psychology that they necessarily incorporate into the experience. I mean, we've heard, people here have heard these experiences, but when you hear them described in the clipped monotone of the professional fighter pilot, it's eerie. But they do describe the very simplistic childhood experience. I just think that's interesting. That one of the fighter pilots that I can think of described an identical experience to a child I have. He said that I was lying on the beach looking up at the sun. My family, family members who had died, was there with me. I learned it is not at all unpleasant to die. And that was his whole experience. Nothing more than that. Just that pure, simple, pure light, white light experience. So there can be no doubt. So the first fact, without a doubt, these are the dying experiences. We will all have these experiences when we die. Saddam Hussein will have them. Omar bin Laden will have them. It doesn't matter if you're a good person or a bad person. It doesn't matter if you believe or if you don't believe. We'll all have this experience when we die. These experiences are, in fact, not near-death experiences, but the dying experience itself. Okay, now I love to show these pictures, so I'm going to show you my pictures real quick, and then I'll tell you the other two facts, and then I'll answer your questions. Next slide. Okay, these experiences described to us by children are virtually identical to adult experiences. Next slide. I love this one. This is a 10-year-old boy that nearly drowned. He states that hands reached into his body and pulled him out and plunged him into darkness. There's Susan Blackmore is a skeptic who has this very complex theory. I love these complicated theories from scientists who should know better. Complex theories in science usually don't fly. And this very sophisticated, she's about 1 million times smarter than me, sophisticated computer model of that the light persists on your retina when you die in the center of it, and the surrounding areas are not as well innervated or vascularized, and so that kind of causes the collapse of your vision to a central spot of light. Great theory. Doesn't fit the clinical data. Unfortunately, so many great theories fall to the wayside. I never hear that described. Never hear that. Instead, it's more like, remember Chris, the noodle guy? You know, the way he says that the car filled up with water and everything went all blank. It's the persistence of consciousness with the lack of input from your body that then causes this darkness. And as an aside, I've heard a lot of people troubled by this darkness. They assume that they're in hell or something like that. But in fact, they just, you know, lucky for them, they only got this far. You know, they didn't get any further through the experience. Many of these so-called negative experiences are really just, they're just all black. They're still conscious with the cessation of input from their body. And then after this black, I love the way kids are. They draw these wonderful pictures and with very few words. He says this is a light, and then a pup tent in a golden field. He just identified that as heaven very laconically. And for him, heaven has a pup tent in a golden field. And then we're going to come, this is our current theme with me. Well, what about the content of these experiences? Did he really go to a heaven that has a pup tent on it that's somewhere south of Jupiter? Well, I wrote the introduction to Betty Eadie's book. And that's a long, complex Mormon near-death experience. And now you see why I love to study kids. I mean, it's just page after page. It's like 148 pages. It's, you know, it's endless. And, you know, with kids, it's just something so cool. It's like, wow, I saw a light. And there was a lot of good things in it. It's the economy of time, too, which I don't have a lot of, as Diane was saying. Easier to hear all these experiences. But anyway, so then people started writing me these letters because I wrote the introduction to Betty's book, and they were like really mean letters. And they were like letters that basically, if you boiled them down to their essence, they said, well, I have a book, a religious book, and what's in my religious book isn't what's in Betty Eadie's book. So how dare you write the introduction to something that obviously isn't true, because what's in my book is different than what's in her book. Or, you know, it's a book they read, like in the Bible written thousands of years ago, or, you know, I mean, it's, you know, that's what I mean by their book. You know, they always reference some sort of, you know, a book that some spiritual leader wrote, etc. And it's different than what Betty Eadie wrote. Well, all I can say, because I'm not a religious philosopher, etc., is that I'll bet you that the pup tent in heaven isn't in any religious book I've ever read. So, you know, so what do you do with that? I mean, so there you go. So, and sometimes I used to write back to them. I used to tell them the story about the pup tent. I said, well, that's probably not in your book either, but I don't think this young man is lying about it. I think he was a Boy Scout, and scouting meant a lot to him. And that comforted him with the processes of dying. So something... boy, if there's one, take-home message from all this, I'll just tell you, I'll put it a different way. The one thing that I use in working with grieving and working with dying patients is this concept that when we die, something meaningful from our life helps us with the dying process. We don't die alone. And that means a lot to people. That, you bet that means a lot. Even if you don't believe in life after death. I can't tell you how many people have just tears come to their eyes to learn that their child does not die alone. As we doctors made them sit out in the waiting room while we did unmentionable things to their children, torturing them in the process of dying. And yet we know that that death was not painful and they didn't die alone. And I've heard this 1,000 times. One young lady told us that a lamb was in the tunnel with us. And I was kind of, when I heard that story, I was kind of like these people who wrote me a letter. I kind of made my own assumptions of, like, the lamb, is that the Lamb of Christ, or all this kind of stuff. Not at all. I talked to the parents and I learned that when this child was 2, she had a special lammy, a stuffed lamb that she always carried with her. We see a lot of pets in children's experiences, you bet. Because they don't have a lot of people in their life who have died necessarily. So a lot of pets in the experience. Or, one thing I know, that if my wife dies before me, maybe this will illustrate the point the best to you. If my wife dies before me, I know that I will see her as part of my dying process. Absolutely. Regardless of what you believe about life after death or etc. And that's an extremely comforting thought to me. But my wife will be there in my dying experience. I sincerely doubt she's going to be there in any of you all's dying experience. Next slide. Okay, here's these hands reaching him out of his body. And aren't these, for people that think that when you have near-death experiences, you have, heightened abilities. Look, this is an amazing drawing for, I think he's an 11 or 12-year-old boy. So these are hands pulling him out of his body. Next slide. Okay, this is a nice, this is this out-of-body experience. I don't know what to think about this out-of-body experience anymore. After I talked to somebody before this, we had this lecture. I'm not going to comment anymore on this out-of-body experience. I don't know if people truly leave their body or not. I'm going to just leave it at that. But people certainly perceive that. They float out. This is a nice example. She's floating out of her body, and that's actually her dad, who she's had a cardiac arrest as part of a radiographical procedure. And her dad picked her up and ran with her to the emergency room, and she felt she was floating out of her body. I will have to tell you that this out-of-body experience, they still are tethered to their bodies. That's for sure. A young man, this is a great story. This young man was digging similar to the construction accident we heard earlier today. He was digging a sand tunnel, and the sand collapsed on him. And then, so he floated out of his body, watched the rescuers dig him out, load him into the gurney, put him in the ambulance, go to the hospital. But he followed along the whole time. It wasn't like the ambulance took off and left his, some sort of disembodied spirit behind. So certainly this extra body is preoccupied with its own body. That's for sure. I'm going to tell you a different story. I think I'm so confused now about this out-of-body experience that I'm going to tell you a story. This also illustrates the problem with, remember I told you about the confabulation hypothesis, that the mind takes a memory gap so it just fills in the scene. This is a great story to refute that. There's a young girl that she nearly died of fulminant mononucleosis, presented to our office, interestingly enough. And then we took her down to the emergency room, put a needle in her heart to resuscitate her. That's near death when you have to do that. Not many survive having a needle stuck in their heart. And she survived. So here's her experience. She has a huge long memory gap. She doesn't even remember coming to our office or any of that. That fits with modern neurology. Short-term, memory loss from trauma. She has another huge memory gap, doesn't remember being in the intensive care unit, doesn't remember being actually in the hospital at all. Her next memory is being out of the hospital again. So it doesn't fit with the confabulation hypothesis. She hasn't filled in something to fill in it all, but she has this teeny little fragment. And the fragment is, she says, when you asked the nurses for that crash cart thing, I saw my grandmother, and who had died. And I was just so shocked to see her, because she had died. And that tells you again how real these experiences are. And so then she says, and then I was back. And I said to her, well, what do you mean you were back? And she said, that's what I've been trying to figure out. So I'm still trying to figure that part out. Next slide. I love these. I got to show you these slides. Here's another out-of-body perception. We're looking down. This is a physician here with a green mask. That's the girl. Next slide. Here's a nice tunnel example. That's Elizabeth. So some of these things are weirdly idiosyncratic, clearly don't come from our culture. This family has a Mormon family, no reason to think that nobody in the family named Elizabeth. They don't have an angel Elizabeth that takes you to heaven when you die. She just said a woman named Elizabeth was there. Next slide. I love this one. This one, we're so far out of the body that see how the rooms are like an architectural drawing. See, we're above them. And then this is the mother and the grandfather hugging in the parent support room. And then he's headed towards that tunnel. Next slide. And then here's another nice tunnel. We're going through this tunnel, and then that bright light that looks like a tip of a cigarette to a brightly lit world. That's a place where he could run and double jump with God. Next slide. And here's a nice tunnel. I love kids because they don't give you any more details. They don't. Whereas, let's face it, adults do. Adults give you lots and lots and lots of details. Adults don't. Children don't. For example, in this one here, he just told me that a figure or presence was at his back. But when I asked him what was the presence, I don't know. He said, all I know is forget my body, forget being alive. I wanted to get to that light. And then this is what he draws the light at. But there are no other details whatsoever. I've already told you every word he had to say about his experience. And we asked him, what are those blue horns? I don't know. Whereas I think an adult would have told us, maybe this was an angel of God, would have, had a more complex story. Next slide. I love these brief fragments. Here's the darkness. Next slide. Here's a great one. Lest we take the content too literally, or actually not, that their heaven is somewhere south of Jupiter or something. These are her living classmates, and that's her living teacher at her bedside, accompanying her during her dying experience. This is a 4th grade girl. My 4th grader, that's all he can talk about is his teacher. His teacher's everything to him. If his teacher says anything, that's true. If I say anything, it's like, but my teacher said, So sure, I can, and that's not, when we went to Japan, interestingly enough, we heard the same thing. Japanese children telling us that their living classmates were part of the experience. And that makes sense to me. Someone that hasn't had a lot of people that have died in their lives. Maybe that's the comfort or the way, maybe some sort of comforting presence that explains itself in different ways. And they seem vividly real. I can't resist. You're at my mercy. I have to tell you all these stories. But I can't resist. I got to tell you these stories because they're too great. To give you an idea of both how real these experiences are, and yet this concept of comforting images, we talked to a 13-year-old who electrocuted herself by taking her, she had a radio while she was in the bathtub, and no GFI switch or anything like that. And so she went to the hospital and was ultimately resuscitated. And afterwards, I was talking to her about it, and she was actually praising us because she really liked that lady in white, that nurse, sat with her throughout her resuscitation. She thought that was really great. And she said that was so comforting. And that woman, who she identified as being a nurse, that sat with her and held her hand while we were sticking all those tubes and needles in her. Well, actually, we don't provide that service in our hospital. She was, in fact, seeing, what someone else might call an angel. She was seeing some sort of spiritual presence. And yet, it's so real. And, so that vivid reality is the hallmark of these experiences, whether they appear to you in dreams, whether they appear to you in waking moments, whether they appear to you as part of the dying experience. Next slide. Sure. Backslide. Last slide. Yeah. Oh, these? I drew those. There you go, funny-looking people. She had a little bit of paralysis in her hand. She didn't make a full neurological recovery, but we admitted her into our study because prospectively, I hastened to add, because we felt that residual paralysis in her hand was not, our formal entrance criteria was full neurological recovery, but we didn't think that some residual weakness was enough. But she just fatigued after drawing all those classmates. So I just drew a few for her. She dictated them to me. Next slide. Okay, here's the light. Yeah, the light, that's all they call it. Next slide. And for those skeptics who think that this is just some sort of spasming of the optic nerve or some sort of fireworks from our occipital lobe when we die, this little girl here wants to make sure you understand. This is again also described as, I saw the light. This is a very brief experience. I saw a weird light, I think she described it as. This might have been the one, I'm not sure, that said there was a lot of good things in it. But you can see this light is anchored by hearts, and then there's these beings down there with hearts. And just, I love talking to kids about this stuff. We asked her who those beings were. I don't know. But whatever these beings are, they have hearts for tails. Next slide. Here's a nice, she's in a heavenly realm, and she's looking down at earth. She draws a picture of her brother with a heart. She said she was supposed to come back to, to life, so to speak, to help her mother with her brother. And in fact, after all of this, months later, he was diagnosed with a congenital heart disease. Next slide. Okay, here's another light. Heavenly realm, we saw that earlier. Next slide. Here's a nice, and I hope you all appreciate that most of these experiences are not particularly religious. This is a religious one. There's another Jesus. If every child said to me, oh yeah, I floated up to heaven and I sat on Jesus' lap, sure, I might be more suspicious that these are just cultural. But they're clearly cultural with something underneath it. And again, very, very fascinating for those of you who are interested in reincarnation. These are grandpas and grandmas and babies who are waiting to be born. Middle class Lutheran family. Next slide.
Wow.
Again, I've hammered on this point of how real the experience is. This comes from Australia. Researchers there sent me this. This is the first child heart transplant in Australia. To show you how, these are the people that assisted him while he was dying. He had a rocky cardiac, he had a couple of cardiac arrests as he's coming off the transplant pump. This is Matthew, his brother. This is Grandma. This is someone named Polly. And this is God. Looking just like everybody else. Next slide. Here's a very mechanistic near-death experience. This young girl here says that these are doctors at her bedside. And this shows, I think, nicely how they incorporate elements of their own resuscitation. This machine here looks like a crash cart. She clearly identified these as 3 doctors. But the kicker being that I asked her how did she know they were doctors. Well, they were 14 feet tall and they had light bulbs in their bodies. Which all the doctors I know are like. She was asked to push a button on that box, but she knew she should not because she would never see her parents again. So still the same kind of decision to return, which of course we see in American near-death experiences, but a very mechanistic experience. Next slide. Okay, let's skip this. And skip this. And skip this. And this. And this. Oh, no, go back to that. That's the one I want. Okay. All right, so clearly when we die, we are conscious and aware and awake. And we have an expanded sense of consciousness beyond our body. And I'll leave it at that. That's fact 1. Okay, I will tell you it's a very interesting, to me anyway, is Chris Carr, is a cultural anthropologist. He's studied near-death experiences from around the world. He's concluded that in fact there is no unique imagery that you can put on a near-death experience. And he also compared modern near-death experiences to the experiences of Tibetan monks. Instead, he said that we learn that when we die, we're conscious, awake, and aware, and it's a time for learning. So we learn things when we die. And that, to me, interestingly enough, is one of the most powerful pieces of, albeit circumstantial evidence, that something happens after we die. Because after all, why would we learn stuff when we die? Why would evolution, create a brain which allows us to learn stuff when we die if we're just going to die? I mean, that would be non-functional, obviously. Next, okay, so that's fact 1. There's 2 other facts. I'll go through them real quick. Second fact, known in medical science for well over 100 years, we have 20% of our brain dedicated to allowing us to have these experiences. For those of you who are offended by this fact, who see this as neuroreductionism at its worst, I can't help you. This is not a controversial fact. Everybody agrees with this, be they atheist or believer alike. Matthew Alpert wrote a book called The God Area of the Brain. He believes that when you die, you simply die. So, even the most rigid skeptics acknowledge that we have about 20% of our brain dedicated to allowing us to have this experience. Of course, Matthew Alpert believes that this area evolved to just give us some final fireworks when we die, and that as human beings, we need to have a God, to kind of direct us and give us meaning to our life, so we evolved it. Sure, kind of far-fetched, but nevertheless, that's his theory. We do, though. This is not controversial. This is from the work of Wilder Penfield, which he took electrical stimulation probes. These areas here, he stimulated parts of the brain in order to understand how it functions. Wilder Penfield is the father of modern neurosurgery. When he stimulated the motor areas of the brain, people moved their arms. When he stimulated the language area of the brain, people would say things, nonsense things or sensible things. And when he stimulated deep in the right temporal lobe, people said things such as, "Oh God, I'm leaving my body." Or even more fascinating, "I'm half in and I'm half out." So that's clear. So when we die, we perceive other realities or other realities superimposed on this one. 20% of our brain is dedicated to allowing us to have this experience. And then the third fact comes to us from modern theoretical physics. I don't know anything about theoretical physics myself, so I went to Los Alamos. I talked to the top theoretical physicists in this country. They heard all this stuff. They said, "Wow, Mel, you really get it." Because kids say things like, "Oh, the experience could have lasted a second, or it could have been my whole life." And I learned from them that the underpinnings of reality are timeless and spaceless. And there are at least 2 other realities which have been identified in the physics lab. At least 2. Not theoretical mathematical constructs, but actually subatomic particles which do not exist in this reality, which are virtually identical to the subatomic particles which make up this reality. Granted, they only last for a billionth of an instant in this reality, but most of the mass in the universe, as I'm sure people know, is not accounted for. And they have identified at least 2 discrete subsets of subatomic particles, which at least in theory could make up other realities. Now, I'm not saying that they have identified angels from other realities or beings from other realities in the physics lab, but nevertheless, they have identified the stuff of at least 2 other realities. So, I've told you all these convoluted explanations for all kinds of things. Explanations, you try to think them through from a scientific standpoint, and you can't even believe that normal, sensible scientists are saying this sort of thing. And yet I'm sharing with you 3 facts which to me are easily connected together. When we die, we see other realities. 20% of our brain dedicated to allowing us to see other realities. And there are other realities. Okay, next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. All right. How do I tie this together with all these different visions? Let's say that our right temporal lobe allows us to perceive other realities. And let's say, speculate now, that substrate of all of reality is timeless and spaceless. Sure, why can't people have premonitions then? If we can use our right temporal lobe to access other information and realities, why not? After-death communications, if it's true that time is only a construct of our body, and that we're all just patterns of energy embedded in other patterns of energy, embedded in other patterns of energy, why couldn't we use our right temporal lobe to either send information out or bring information back in and receive after-death communications? Especially when so many of these after-death communications are so simplistic. They just stop crying. You know, I'm okay. I mean, that's not a huge piece of information, you know, that needs to be, you know, downloaded, if you will. So I've tried to put a new understanding of what we physicians call dissociation, and you all call near-death or out-of-body experiences. Instead of, our current society focuses on this. Near-death experiences, by definition, are psychotic visions, are hallucinations. I've tried to use a more naturalistic way of interpreting death-related visions in general, related to near-death experiences, premonitions of death, after-death communications, shared dying experiences. Why not? Those two sisters I was telling you about, the mom dies. As she dies, her right temporal lobe is activating, you know, allowing her to have this near-death experience. We know that telepathy is a normal human function. We know that telepathy is probably right temporal lobe based. So why couldn't they have, through telepathic means, shared her dying experience and then each one interpreting it in their own ways? Spiritual visions in general. I hear so many people say, well, I didn't have a near-death experience. Well, our right temporal lobe is probably activated in a variety of clinical situations. Child abuse. Ken Ring, everybody got mad at Ken Ring because he dared to suggest that people who have near-death experiences are often the victims of child abuse. Well, everybody got mad at him because the paradigm was, oh, they're the victims of child abuse, so they're fantasizing that they're out of their body. Maybe when you're being abused as a child, that's a good time to get your right temporal lobe working and get one with God and start to, you know, to input some information from the world at large that might create some meaning for you in the context of a terrible experience. We see a lot of spontaneous visions. People just have visions in typing class. And you can learn a lot from I'm going to tell you, from those kinds of visions, just as near-death experiences. We have one young man, he had an experience in typing class. That kind of monotonous, probably induced a meditative state, activated his right temporal lobe, and then he says, I heard the sound of life all wrapped up and rolled up in a ball of light, and it rang so loud, and yet so soft the aware only think they hear it, and the unaware can't hear it at all. And that's what these experiences mean to me. I'm trying to be someone who's aware and hear things that I only think that I can hear in my own personal life. That's what these experiences mean to me. And I see this happening again and again. And I'm going to give you just some examples, and these examples, I hope I answer some questions people ask me. I have a friend doesn't think anything of near-death experiences or any of this stuff. He calls it, Mel, why are you involved in that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross death and dying crap? Well, I have a lot of friends like that, because most of my friends are physicians. So I said to him, well, you've never had a spiritual experience? I find that so hard to believe. I mean, we know from studies that it's the most common kind of experience that human beings have. You've never had one? So listen to what this guy says. This guy's a head of gastroenterology at Seattle Children's Hospital. And he free associates and tells me this story. He says, well, you know, one night I came home from the hospital and I was really tired. And I kind of fell asleep at a stoplight. And then I woke up and I was like seized with indigestion. And I knew I was going to throw up. And I had so much pain I couldn't go through the light. I felt I just had to pull over to the side of the road. And just as I was starting to do that, a car came whizzing through the intersection. So if he hadn't had this coincidence of indigestion, he would have gone through the intersection and would have nearly died, or been in a serious accident. So that's what he told me was a spiritual experience. And I believe him. That was a spiritual experience for him. And why do I think that? Well, I have over 150 variations of that story in my file. That's the old, something prevented me from going through the intersection and I would have been in a car accident. But listen to how the other stories are. Many of them are, in fact, a woman in white, appearing as an apparition. Don't go any further. Many of them are a sound. Stop. Don't go on. Many of them, if not most of them, are feelings. Feelings. I just knew I shouldn't have done it. But it's a different kind of knowing. It's a knowing that's palpably real. And that's when people have asked me, well, how do I know whether my experience is genuine or not? I can only tell you it has a quality to it that's unlike other experiences. And we found the same breakdown in our sudden infant death study. Remember I told you 33% of moms have, moms and dads have these premonitions. But listen to what the premonitions were. Actually, very few of them were the flamboyant story I told you before, of floating out of the body, the woman in white, etc. That's actually not what we usually heard. Many of them were dreams that were vividly real. Many of them were voices. One, actually a physician father, said that he was boarding a plane to go to New Orleans and he heard a voice say, "Stop, go back, he will die." And many of them are just feelings. I just had a feeling, but a different feeling than our control patients. A feeling that was so palpably real, it stopped them in their tracks. That they just stopped with a horrible feeling of dread. Unlike our control, ordinary fears, etc. And that's what I think we need to be attentive to. That in many ways, hearing that some people see angels, then we think, well, if I didn't see an angel, well, I didn't have a real spiritual experience. Well, I never understood this till about 4 or 5 years ago when my wife told me that she actually sees ideas. Well, I don't. I just hear, that internal narrator. That left temporal. There's a beautiful symmetry in all this, by the way. Our left temporal lobe allows us to communicate and use language in this reality. Our right temporal lobe apparently allows us to communicate with whatever these other realities are. But no other side. It's all one side. It's all going on all at once, all embedded in each other. At least that's what the theoretical physicists tell me. So I just learned this by chance. My wife was actually reviewing some of my information and heard a lecture I said, and she said, well, I see pictures all the time. So when she makes a grocery list, she actually sees an apple. I don't see an apple. I hear the word apple, or I just think apple. So maybe that's the way it is with spiritual experiences as well. Maybe some of us see things. That's just the way our brain works. Others hear things. And most of us, I think, just feel things. And so what I'm saying is that intuition is the handmaiden, or integrally integrated with what we call spiritual visions. And I'd like to conclude by sharing with you a story that Frank Oski told me. And Frank Oski is arguably the dean of pediatrics. And he was at Johns Hopkins when I was a professor there. And he actually didn't tell me the story. He wrote this story in one of the journals he edits late in his life. When he was one of my professors at Hopkins, he was a very rigorous, kind of demanding. I certainly never thought he had a spiritual bone in his body, and probably had sometimes wanted to break every bone in his body. So, and here's his story. He said he was very troubled by children who died at an early age from heart disease. And as a medical student, he could not come to grips with the fact that these children would often, his particular patient, lived to about age 4 and then died. putting the parents basically through 4 years of hell. And he couldn't understand that or come to grips with it. It was a horrible thing. And he thought this was wrong. And it was against nature. And how could a loving God permit this to happen? And he said that one night after this patient he had died, and he's, you know, as a medical student does, we get very involved in the families of our patients. And he said that he had a dream. But it was unlike any dream he'd had before. And it was a woman in white that stood at the foot of his bed. And this woman said to him that it nurtures us and teaches us something about our own humanity to care for a child who's less than perfect. That's what Frankowski said. And I learned a lot from that. In fact, I learned in dealing with my own teenagers at the time, who I perceived as being less than perfect. But I learned a lot from that. And, that these children often know secrets of living that would be inaccessible to them in any other way, and secrets that we could not learn unless we cared for them. But listen to the end of what he had to say. So you can see why I don't care about life after death, because then he concludes he actually wrote this as an editorial in one of the mainstream medical journals. Of course, it was right before he died, so he probably felt like he had nothing to lose at that point. He said, "I don't ask you to believe my story. If this happened to someone else and they told me about it, I wouldn't believe it either. He said, I only ask that you be open and attentive to the ordinary miracles of everyday life." But Frankowski didn't have an ordinary miracle. He had a woman in white appear at the foot of his bed, telling him the secrets of life. So why does he conclude that, though? And that, I have chewed over that since I read it 5 years ago. Because he's not saying, look for a woman in white. Pray before you go to bed, and a woman in white will come to you. He said, be attentive to the ordinary miracles of everyday life. And the more I work with the grieving and death and dying, the more I understand what he had to say. Because so many times these experiences come to us as ordinary miracles in our everyday life. We had a death in our family. Our cousin Julie died. She loved hummingbirds. Suddenly, everyone who loved her, the next day, dozens of hummingbirds were surrounding their homes and banging their beaks on the windows. And it wasn't even the time of year that we usually see hummingbirds. I've had patients tell me that coincidences such as suddenly finding a parking place have convinced them that their daughter who had died was there with them in spirit and had facilitated such an event. And these experiences, they don't lend themselves to objective verification. And I'm at the point in my career now where I no longer... And think about it. If an angel from God appeared right now and said, Dr. Morse is right, listen up you guys, that wouldn't be enough proof. That wouldn't be enough proof, would it? Everybody would leave, guys are victims of mass hallucinations, blah, blah, blah. That wouldn't be enough proof. Even for the people who witnessed this, that wouldn't be enough proof. What if that angel from God distributed a metal trinket stamped, made by God? And it was of a metal that we could take to the laboratory and shown was not a metal found here on Earth. That wouldn't be enough proof. It wouldn't be. Just 3 years ago, I was in Arizona at the great meteor that came from outer space. Maybe I snuck down there and hacked off a little bit of that meteor. Maybe I made up a whole bunch of these little trinkets. Maybe I had my daughter. While you guys were distracted looking at me, my daughter was passing it out to you all. And you all didn't see her do that. I mean, do you see what I'm saying? That wouldn't be enough proof. And I'm going to just close with an example from my own life. I went to a conference, death and dying conference, and worked with some grieving parents. And actually, the mom was there. I always think of them as moms, but this was a, this was a middle-aged woman whose spouse had died unexpectedly of a heart attack. Tragedy. Left her completely unprepared. And about a year after he died, she got a postcard from her dentist. In fact, it arrived a year after his death. And the postcard had a scene from Cannon Beach, which is near where we live, of Haystack Rock. And this was like where their love had come together. And this was a place that had meaning for them. And after hearing my talk, she said, now I understand that postcard. That postcard was mine. She kind of knew this all along anyway, but something about my talk made her really feel, oh, this postcard really was something from my husband. And she had even called up the dentist and learned from the dentist that it really was a coincidence. That he just had a big box of 1,000 scenes of the Northwest, and she just coincidentally happened to get the one from Haystack Rock. She could have gotten any one of 1,000 different scenes. So it really was a coincidence, but it was a coincidence that had meaning to her. Okay, so my wife is, I actually put this in a book that I wrote, and my wife was reading the book, and at the end of the book she goes, don't put in that postcard story. That's so hokey. I mean, that obviously was a coincidence. I mean, don't put that story in. That's going to undermine your credibility. So I said, oh, okay, well, I guess, I won't put it in. So my wife says, no, put in my story instead. Listen to her story. Her story. Well, listen to her story. Her story, which she had never shared with me, was that after the death of my brother-in-law, which was a tragic death for all concerned, very, very troubling death, she was then in the process of calling up his old friends to bring them to the funeral and to let them know that Chris had died. And she called up one of their friends from San Francisco. We live in Seattle. And this was a friend that hadn't seen Chris in about 20 years. And she said, well, Chris has died. And their friend said, actually your call was expected. He said, last night, I just had a feeling about Chris. I hadn't thought about him in so many years. But something happened to me last night. I just started thinking about him. And, all night long, my girlfriend and I were just talking about Chris, and I was just telling her stories about Chris, and I don't even know why it was. And now you've called this morning to tell me Chris has died, and so now I understand. So that's the story my wife wanted me to put in my book, which I did, because I'm not done. Think about it. Think about it. That story would just be a coincidence to someone else. Someone else would say,